What's going on, everybody? This is live stream number 33, and the question of the hour is: Has Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, changed the mind of China when it comes to invading Taiwan? Obviously, that's a burning question. Nobody knows what's going to happen there. Is China going to invade Taiwan, or is it not? Or are they just talking noise? Or what's the question? We all know China wants Taiwan. They claim it still as China, and right, there's a lot of people that are in this world that aren't going to allow that to transpire. So has what's unfolded in the war in Ukraine changed China's mind? That's where we're going to kick around. So I got many of the usual suspects tonight. I'm going to go around the horn and introduce them. So first and foremost, I got Les. Les has his own YouTube channel called Pegasus Tests. Make sure you check him out. He's a veteran of the Gulf War. He was a United States Marine in the early 90s. He also has his own logistics company and his own tactical training company called Polaris Tactics and Simulations Division. And they just got done hosting Woodland Brutality. Is that right, Les?
That's correct. It was a great success.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing the videos over that. So Les always brings a great perspective to the chat. Les, thanks for jumping on tonight.
Glad to be here, brother.
All right. So I don't have an actual video feed of him, but we got Rob. If you guys remember and watched the China brief video that we did way early on when we started streaming, Rob was a naval officer. He served on a surface warfare vessel, and he was just a great expert on the PLAN and gave us an outstanding brief. If you guys have not seen that, please go check that brief out. It's outstanding. So, Rob, thanks for coming on tonight, man.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right, next we got the good Bruce at Camp Armament. That is his YouTube channel. That is his Instagram. If you guys have watched my YouTube channel for any amount of time, you know that Bruce is like my right-hand man. You'd be hard-pressed to find a video that he's not in. But make sure you check out his own YouTube channel, Bruce at Camp Armament. Bruce brings a civilian perspective to the chat, and he was a former aircraft mechanic and just has a lot of training at civilian-oriented tactical training schools. And again, he brings that civilian perspective, which is badly needed. So, Bruce, thanks for joining us tonight, brother. Next, got my buddy Chad. Chad and I served together back in Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines in Afghanistan, 2011 time frame, Helmand Province. Chad is a Marine veteran that also served in the 2003 Iraq invasion and redeployed in 2004 and fought in the Battle of Fallujah. Chad is studying for his military doctorate's degree, and he's just a wealth of knowledge, and it's always a pleasure having him on. Thanks for coming on tonight, Chad.
Appreciate it.
All right, next, we got the good doc, Dr. Christopher Larson. And Doc has his own YouTube channel called Christopher Larson. Be sure to check it out. He's got several videos uploaded. Doc is an accomplished author. He's written many books on small unit tactics. He's the original founder of the One Shepherd Leadership Institute. He served in the United States Army and is a veteran of serving in Korea, the silent war that's taken place. So Doc always has an awesome intellectual opinion on these matters. And Doc, thanks for coming on tonight.
I just didn't know we were supposed to be incognito. I would have worn my Halloween costume.
All right, guys, that is our panel. And as a reminder, Rob is on tonight, but he's audio only. So as usual, kicking it off to our starting pitcher, Pegasus Test. Take it.
All right. Well, has Ukraine changed China's mind about invading Taiwan? I sure as hell hope so. They have to be wondering about the equipment in their army because they copy the Soviet/Russian stuff, and that stuff's not performing particularly well. Combine that with a military that has not traditionally performed well, and they've got to be looking at their chances of success being a whole lot lower than it used to be.
We'll just go around the horn, guys. So, Bruce, you got it.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Yeah, I think it's got to be in the mind of China, and it's got to be in the mind of every military around the world, because this is not turning out as anybody expected, more than anyone, probably Russia. But I think the one thing that we learned, and not to get into too many details, but things like heavy tanks that have really have really shaped the battlefield, or we felt would shape the battlefield, they're no match for artillery, and artillery's taken out whatever Russia rolls forward, even their most up armored T-90s. They really just do not stand a chance. And those tanks may be great against something like other tanks, but they just don't seem to have a very good survivability rate against anything that's top down, and particularly dumb munitions like artillery. So I think that's something that every military is going to have to look at and weigh. Certainly China's doing it with Taiwan. And I think that something else that every country should learn is that if you want to invade a country today, you have a very short window to do it and do it successfully, because we have spooled up now, and the U.S. alone is spending more money in Ukraine than we were spending in Afghanistan. So give us a couple of months and let the world turn against you. And if you have not accomplished your goals, you're probably not going to be successful in doing so. And that's my initial take on it anyway.
Yeah, it's a good question. To say have they changed their mind means that they were prepared to use military force in the first place. And I don't know. I thought so. I certainly would have been someone who said, yeah, that's the case. But the fact that they didn't, that China did not move when Russia invaded Ukraine, it suggests, I mean, if ever there was a time, that would have been or at least it seems to us looking from the outside, that would have been the time, right? Everybody's preoccupied. Yes, it might have put us into a world war, but they didn't make a move, and they didn't seem prepared. It's almost as if the war in Ukraine caught the Chinese government off guard. So, I just don't know that they changed their mind. The question is, were they prepared to go in the first place? But I do believe, having said that yes, the Chinese government is watching the crisis, the war in Ukraine, very, very closely and trying to glean all the lessons it can. And I'm sure we'll get into that tonight.
So the proper answer here is I don't know. But if I have to take a stance, I'm going to say I don't think Ukraine has changed any minds. I think there may be some reflections on what's going on there by the CCP, but I think the ambitions are still there. I think there are some major differences between the two. Ukraine has allies surrounding its border. Taiwan is right off the shore of China. It would be very difficult for us to supply Taiwan if China, say, for example, blockaded the entire country. So I think there's some major differences there. We're at some disadvantages. We closed all our bases in the Philippines, even though recently I read the Philippine government's open to allowing U.S. forces to reestablish there under certain conditions. But, we got Japan right there, and that's about it. So if this does go down, it's probably going to be a little more interesting to watch than the Ukraine battle.
Well, evening, gents. I would say that the timeline has definitely moved to the right. And I'll get into more later on why I think that. I don't know. I agree with Chad. I don't think it necessarily has changed their mind or their general calculus. But in particular, looking at the air defense disaster that the Russian Air Force is going through, it's got to be making some of the PLAAF guys think twice. And then on top of that, global support. I don't think they anticipated the ostracism Russia's going through. China's far more integrated in the world economy, and we can speak more about that. It would be harder to ostracize them like we're doing with the Russians, but it's definitely, they have more to lose on the global scale than Russia does. Putin spent a lot of years trying to fortify his economy and make it as self-sufficient as possible. The Chinese have a lot to lose if a similar kickback or blowback happens to them.
And my 2 cents is I agree a lot with what Rob just said and what a lot of the other guys have just said. I mean, if they've got to be watching this conflict under a microscope, and it's got to be taking them back by the global support behind Ukraine and the effect that's happened, right? So it's, a lot can be said for Russia going into Ukraine because, they were thinking about joining NATO. But, well, what's the byproduct of all this? Now you have countries that weren't even talking about joining NATO all of a sudden, getting in line potentially. and it's not going well for them. Plus, we're seeing a lot of their premier weapon systems falling into Ukrainian hands, and subsequently those in the West. And aircraft being knocked out. We're seeing the use of small man-portable drones having a major impact on what look like rear echelon troops, driving in unarmored vehicles. And hell, some of those videos I'm watching where they're dropping aerial grenades from these little tiny drones, the guys ain't even walking around with weapons. Like those look like some RIMF Russians to me. So we're seeing a lot out of Ukraine, and I think the big takeaway is China's seeing the global reaction to this and how much support has been thrown behind Ukraine, and how a country like Ukraine, which wasn't a paper tiger, it was a force to be reckoned with, but in comparison to the Russians, at a sizable disadvantage in terms of numbers and equipment, holding their own very well. So there's a lot of same similarities between the conflict there and what potentially could be a conflict between Russia and Taiwan if that were to kick off. And they definitely are probably rethinking their battle plans at this point.
Yeah, all good points, Brent. And while there's similarities between the two, there's also major differences. You pointed out like land borders there for easy resupply. At the same token, 100 miles of strait is a large body of water. Yeah, some of the Chinese vessels have weapon systems that could hit Taiwan without untying from the dock, but that's not a lot of them. Also, one of the things I found very, very interesting, a lot of the incursions that are being done into Taiwanese sea space and airspace are being done by the PLAAF, the Air Force. Seems like the Chinese Navy is sitting this one out activity-wise. Rob, you might be able to comment to that. I'm only going off what I see off of open sources on the web, but it doesn't seem like the Chinese fleet's out there really raising a big stink as the Air Force is.
Yeah, good point, Les. From what I've seen, the objective for those incursions is to get the Taiwanese to expend their aircraft. And I'm sure Bruce can speak about this, but airframes only have so many hours to run before they have to be overhauled or replaced. So I guess the idea is to get the Taiwanese Air Force to expend itself before an actual war. But you do bring up a great point. A lot of the carrier aviation is still in its infancy. I mean, they have the one carrier that they built from the old Ukrainian, ironically, carrier, and then they're doing some small home-built ones. But honestly, with 100 miles on the strait, you can do a lot from land bases. So I think it's going to be mainly an Air Force thing. We'll see if the Naval Air Wing will want to step itself up, but it's definitely concerning. And I think from the Chinese perspective, I mean, dude, Su-34s, Su-30s, some of these heavy-hitting Russian fighters and bombers getting knocked out by man-pads and Soviet-era missiles. It's got to be making the Chinese worry. They haven't been in a war since the 70s, and they got their butts kicked guerrilla style. They haven't been in a proper, call it full-scale conventional conflict since their civil war. And technology has come a long way since 1949. And you better guarantee that we're going to be selling the Taiwanese, the Japanese, the Koreans, Filipinos with enough money, the best anti-air weapons money can buy. And we'll be making many, many more of them. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, super great point there. I think one of the lessons of this Ukraine conflict is that the West can, if they have an ally that's willing to fight, has no problem supplying it. The Ukrainians are very willing to fight, and it seems like NATO's falling all over itself to provide weapons. There's a little hiccups at the beginnings, but there seems to be a pretty good pipeline going in there, and all the pictures you're seeing now, you're seeing the javelins, the NLAWs, and the equipment getting there. You're quickly seeing the Soviet era stuff fade away from what's in the hands of Ukrainian troops. And I would imagine that if China goes for Taiwan and doesn't secure it very quickly, that the same thing is going to happen. I mean, you already have the Japanese Navy actively patrolling the area. and saying they'll come to the Taiwanese aid very overtly. And if there's any chance that you can keep an airport open on that island, we'll probably be flooding it with transport aircraft full of weapons, a la just the same way Ukraine experienced at the beginning of their conflict.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. Look, this is purely conjecture. Well, the second half of it is. Let's just say
Well,
this.
we did such a great job predicting Ukraine.
Ooh, a little scary. Yeah. Oh, all right. So here's the point. Yeah, I think it's a fair thing to say, although there are exceptions. I think it's fair to say that historically speaking, large empires throw their weight around for regional influence. Okay. Think about, what you can just say, like America. In 1983, we invaded Grenada. In 1989, we invaded Panama. And I'm not saying we didn't have good reason. That's not my argument at all. My argument is that in our own region, in our own hemisphere, a large empire can throw its weight around pretty much unchecked in a regional conflict, right? And we see this with the Soviet Union and Hungary in 1950s, and was it Yugoslavia in 1960s. And Poland, I think, in the early 1970s. And so, China has its own. Rob said that they haven't had a major war since 49. That's more or less true. Of course, they were involved in 1950 to 53. They backed the Koreans in a pitched battle or a pitched war there, 3-year long, and it didn't fare well for China. They did okay in the beginning, but in the long run, that didn't fare well. The next year, I think they learned a lot of lessons fighting the United Nations on the Korean Peninsula, because in 54, they go into Tibet and they win pretty handily in a regional campaign. And again, the rest of the world just kind of turned a blind eye. In the 1979, or I think it was 79, anyway, late 70s, they try to show Vietnam what's what. And again, they got their hands smacked. But whether their hands are smacked or whether they actually get their way, my point here is that the rest of the world kind of looks the other way and says, well, they're the regional power. And they're a world power. So I'm going to let them get away with it. Now, conjecture time. Isn't it interesting that Russia went it alone with Ukraine? They didn't form a coalition. It looked like they started to do that economically with, Iran and Syria and China for in an economic sense, but formed no military coalition. And I think what's kind of telling here is maybe Russia would have had more success had it synchronized and coordinated with China. Said, look, we're going west, you go east, because that would have complicated. Really tiny, and you never get an apples to apples comparison. But think about this. So one guy decides, I'm going to go in California and I'm just going to steal a bunch of blue jeans from this store. I don't know, whatever it is, the American Eagle. And I'm just going to go steal a bunch of blue jeans and try to run. He'll get caught, before in California anyway. And so since they decriminalized that, now he walks in with 28 of his buddies and, family and friends, and they go in, they steal just about everything from the store and run in at 28 directions. This is very, very hard for any kind of security force to cover down on. And so I kind of think that's the same thing. Had there been multiple efforts, and I'm just looking at China and Russia, but we know there are other players. There's Venezuela, there's, Cuba, there's Iran, there's North Korea. Had they built some kind of coalition, you wonder, of course, you would have been risking world war. So I'm sure that's why they didn't do it. In retrospect, and again, conjecture, seems like that might have been the strategically sound thing to do in today's world. I don't know.
Yeah, Doc, I couldn't agree more talking about the sphere of influence. The major question is, you want to compare the two, Ukraine and Taiwan? Europe has interest in Ukraine because it's right by their border. Do they have any interest in Taiwan? Are they going to send reinforcements to Taiwan? Are they going to do anything? I doubt it. And, Europe makes up a large part of NATO. So you have another problem there. Is NATO going to be interested in getting involved in Taiwan? I seriously doubt it. The major players are going to be us, the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Australians. That's probably about it.
What about the Indians?
Yeah, well, I'm getting to that. I actually have that. I got some stuff on the Indians too, but Taiwan isn't officially recognized on the world stage either. Ukraine is. That's another problem. So I'm not sure how involved the world is going to be. I'm not sure that you're going to see the involvement that you saw in Ukraine with Taiwan. You know, I hope I'm wrong. I really do. But I want to kind of jump to something else real quick. Talking about why China hasn't really acted on anything yet. I don't know if you guys have been keeping up with the news, but there's a lot of protests going on in China right now over the COVID-19 lockdowns. And as I've stated before, totalitarian regimes always fight a two-front war. They fight it internally and they fight it externally. They have to waste resources, military, police, on keeping that iron grip on their society. Well, I think one of the reasons we really haven't seen anything move yet is because of what's going on in Shanghai and Hong Kong. Shanghai, you know, you can understand it going on in Hong Kong, but it's going on in Shanghai too. So not to mention those freedom protests in Hong Kong, that was only last year. So I think the Chinese have a lot of internal issues that they're probably focused on right now. And I think Taiwan is kind of taking a back seat. And that may be why you haven't seen anything move on Taiwan.
Valid point, Chad.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think we absolutely have to talk about what one of the guys in the chat brought up was the microchips that Taiwan manufactures. That's the skin in the game. That's why your average soccer mom cares versus doesn't care. It's all about how does it impact us, right? And so if there was any kind of disruption in Taiwan's economy and manufacturing, which a war would certainly bring, where are we going to get these microchips from? You can't just spool up and start producing those somewhere else tomorrow. Yes, you can start, but it's going to take a long time before you have those. Taiwan is one of only, I think, 3 places that really manufactures these microchips and does them well. We're already seeing a shortage in some of these chips. If you guys remember, just a few months ago, we were having a hard time. You had to get on a waiting list to get a truck. My brother bought a new Jeep. He was on a waiting list to get a new Jeep. Although that's not the exact same type of chip that Taiwan necessarily makes, if we're making those chips somewhere else, it's going to have an impact, right? And it's going to grow. So I think that we have to kind of remember that that's the stake that everybody has. And when phones start going down and chips, vehicles, you can't buy new vehicles. Vehicles start going down. And these are chips not only just for your personal devices. These are chips that, man, they end up, they run things like telephone lines. They run things like power grids, things that are absolutely essential to our country today. That's our skin in the game. And that's why we'll be defending Taiwan. And that's why, in a lot of ways, it'll be far more important than a war against Ukraine. Ukraine could probably disappear tomorrow, and it wouldn't have a huge impact on all of us. Food sources around the world, yes. In the U.S., maybe not so much. But you get rid of Taiwan, that's a whole different story.
Excellent point from Chad and Bruce. I would say with the Chinese, you got to understand, it's like a bunch of highly educated gangsters in charge of the biggest nuclear economy in the world. All right. The Chinese Communist Party, they're run almost like the mafia with Xi Jinping at the top. And he understands that if he can't keep a good high cost of living and his people fed, happy, give them blue jeans and iPhones, etc., he's got bigger problems than Taiwan on his hands. So Chad brought up a great point. You're fighting a two-front war. You're fighting the authoritarian battle to keep control at home, and then you're worrying about the Taiwanese military, which is no slouch. They're small, but they're technologically advanced, and they're pretty motivated to fight. The jury's out on whether or not the Taiwanese population or the world population will support Taiwan if China goes all out and hits the beaches. But it's definitely more a world war of opinion necessarily than just ships versus missiles, etc., which is still very important. And I'd also add that it's not necessarily China winning or losing on the island. They will eventually win if it's in a vacuum, if nobody comes to help Taiwan. It's a matter of time. But whether or not they can hold the island against the rested population and take the island with minimum losses without embarrassing themselves on the world stage and destabilizing themselves at home, that's probably the bigger calculus. That's what she is thinking. That's what the 8 members of the Politburo are thinking. There's only a handful of very powerful men at the top that make this decision, and they're more concerned with keeping power, period. So when you have all those people in Shanghai with their windows open wailing during the COVID lockdowns, it might not be the best time to, put it all on black, so to say, with Taiwan. And I might also add the whole public opinion thing. Australia, South Korea, Japan, unfortunately, the Philippines just elected a guy who's pretty pro-China, but a lot of those heavy hitters in Southeast Asia, they're just as powerful and they're just as important as the Europeans. And they have a warrior culture and they don't want to be swallowed up by China. They're like Poland. They know they're next if they lay down and let Taiwan fall. So really it just goes to who's going to come to the aid of Taiwan and how long they can hold out. And if they can fight like the Ukrainians, I'm of the opinion you might see a bunch of Chinese ships sinking in the Strait. We won't have social media like we do in Ukraine because it's not a land-based war, but you can't hide ships sinking. And I'm sure the PLAN has seen the Moskva sinking and then the other Russian ships that have been killed in port or at sea. And they might be thinking twice. The Ukrainians didn't have that advance of shore-based shore-based anti-ship cruise missile batteries. They're really just upgraded kayak missiles. But they were able to do they were able to sink the Moskva just fine. Thank you.
Yeah, Rob, you bring up an incredibly good point there. In the naval battle in Ukraine, they're winning against Russia, and they don't really have any ships, and that's an important point. You can question how the targeting is going and who's giving their information to them. That seems to be some conjecture out there, but I think it's safe to say that the Ukraine has successfully forestalled an amphibious invasion on Odessa. They've taken out the flagship. That's pretty important. Any ship can be a flagship, but like it was said, I think back in World War II, why do you not have a USS United States? Because you never want to see a headline that says United States sunk, and now Russia's had to suffer, Moscow sunk. So I think the Chinese are in a good position the Taiwanese are in a good position to hold the PLAN at bay because you can reinforce the Republic of Taiwan's Navy very easily with anti-ship missiles versus getting them hulls over there and crews to man them. So getting across that strait is going to be a difficult thing. And I think a lot of non-naval personnel don't realize just how far 100 miles can be.
All right. So related to all of that, but looking, so we're focused on, we're looking at Ukraine, we're looking at Ukraine and Russia, we're looking at China and Taiwan. But one of the commenters here, Hemingway, asked, hey, should the U.S. be preparing? And my answer is emphatically yes. So emphatically, yes, we should be preparing. I think it's telling that, again, there are so many differences between Ukraine and Taiwan. It's almost not worth saying, but they do have some parallels. All right. And mostly the parallels are that we're humans and that this is nations, that are at war or considering war. So here's what you got going. Just as Estonia and Poland, already mentioned, just as Estonia and Poland are worried about being next on Russia's chopping block, Japan and South Korea have every right to say, wow, if Taiwan falls, we're next on the chopping block. So for those countries, we would expect a pretty robust defense. What I think is telling is that NATO, Germany in particular, who has this ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, which is 1990, right? And for 32 years, European nations such as Germany have chastised their military. have demonized their military, have defunded their military, and cut them in any way they can. They took great joy in doing this. It was virtual signaling on a nationalist level. Look at us, we're so great. We don't even need these yahoos. We keep them around to give fanatic, wannabe Nazis a job. And they really were so condescending to their military professionals. And again, they choked the living life out of them. So much so that when the balloon went up in Ukraine, NATO had nothing to respond with. Other than words, sharp words, no military, and asking, looking over the shoulder saying, right, America? Yeah, you guys are bad. Right, America? But now, 2 months later, Europe has finally learned something. And that is that Germans firmly believed, as a cultural people for the last 32 years, they believed that their liberal democracy was so admired, was so valued by the rest of the world that it wouldn't need any defense. It wouldn't need defense because people are just going to see how cool the Germans are and say, man, you guys are spectacular. This makes no sense, though. When, on a surface level, it's kind of like, yeah, that's cool. But then start to think what they're saying. We have something so valuable. No one will want it, and no one will want to destroy it. How does that make sense? If it's that valuable, someone will either want it or need to destroy it. And so finally, they're sitting up going, think about the first 2 weeks of the war in Ukraine and all of the social media and people saying, I just can't believe in 2022 that we're still human beings, that we're still nation states, that we're still fighting wars. It was a wonderful, warm sentiment, but it also was absolutely clueless, like no historical perspective. And I don't mean historical like, in the last 300 years. I mean historical in the last 30 years. They were selectively ignoring the war in Georgia, the war in Yugoslavia, the wars in Ukraine and Crimea. There's never been a European war. Yes, there had been for 30 years in Chechnya and all of these other places. And so I'm going, no. The Caucasian nations have been warring steadily for that 32-year period, but everybody pretended that they hadn't. Well, this war is shocking. Why? Because cities are reduced to rubble. And when cities are reduced to rubble, and I don't mean to be racist, and I'm not saying it's racist. I'm saying when people you can look at on the TV that look like your grandmother are walking out of burning cities in rubble, suddenly everybody sat up and said, wait a minute, we do have something valuable here. We need to protect ourselves. Don't think for a minute that the rest of Asia isn't saying the same thing about Taiwan. Even though Taiwan doesn't have strong ties and isn't recognized, widely as a sovereign nation, even though all of that is true, don't think that the rest of Asia isn't saying, wow, we better prepare. So when you ask me, should America prepare? Yeah, we have something valuable.
Hey, I saw something on Fox News earlier, and I know Dan Crenshaw has kind of been a contentious individual in terms of some of the things he said. Question whether or not he's a rhino or not. But anyways, all that aside, he made a very good point, I thought, when I was watching this interview on Fox News earlier. He pretty much said that all the support that's going to Ukraine and enabling the Ukrainians to hold their own against the Russians is bogging the Russians down. And the Russians are 100% focused and committed to this effort, and it's degrading and attriting their forces to the point to where we're getting to the point where we can almost exclusively focus on China. We can focus our main efforts on China because our two biggest competitors were Russia and China. Obviously, China probably the bigger of the two, but now that Russia is being degraded and attrited, we can reorient our focus heavier on China because of this stuff that's going on. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
I think it's certainly too early for that. I think he's getting the cart before the horse there. I see where he's going with it. And I was looking at numbers of projected Russian tank losses. The Ukrainians are saying there was almost 800 at this point. And I know one of the guys in chat said it was one tank that's been photographed 5 times. That's simply not true. There's actually a group of guys that are focusing on all these destroyed tanks, and they're trying to identify every single one that they can and verify what model it is and what area it was in and its type of destruction, whether it was blown up, broke down, or captured. And they've already been able to identify over 500 different main battle tanks. And we're not talking about support vehicles, but main battle tanks that have been destroyed, abandoned, or lost somehow within Ukrainian borders. So that is a lot. And, not counting the aircraft, not counting the loss of life, which we don't know the number of exactly. And those grow every single day. What has Ukraine lost? Don't know. I don't know if there's anybody really keeping up with that information either, because the information coming out of Ukraine is obviously pro-Ukrainian, and the Russians aren't letting all their troops run around on cell phones and report everything that's going on so that we can track that either. But I guess my point being is that I would not sell Russia short yet. They're obviously changing tactics because what they thought was going to work didn't work. They completely failed with that initial invasion, and they're having to recalculate at this point. They're not headed back to Moscow with their tail between their legs yet. And what that tells me is that they're going to do a complete rebalance, and they're going to try to accomplish something. What that something is, I'm not sure, but they're going to try to accomplish something. We could stay focused with obviously our money, which is happening, to help grind the Russians down. But I think just as important, maybe more important, is probably the intelligence that we're giving them. We didn't just randomly fire a missile out into the ocean and sink to Moscow. That happened with some very, very, very good intelligence saying this ship is at this location and you have the capabilities to take this ship out. We aren't just by luck killing generals left and right. We're also there's information going there going, this general is here. And I think what's important for everybody to understand, and this is sort of the beauty of warfare, it's a little different from what we had in World War II and in Korea and even Vietnam, is we have satellites everywhere. And we're literally we can watch a soldier leave his house in Moscow, get in a car, ride a bus, hop on a train, load his tank up on the train, move to the Russian border, drive that tank across the Ukrainian border and get killed. We can watch that. We can track that. We're that good. And we're doing it in some cases. We've been doing it for a long time. We did it when they had that book anti-aircraft launcher shoot down that Malaysian, I believe it was, aircraft that flew over Ukraine. We tracked all that down through satellite imagery and cell phone photos, and we could see when that thing was loaded up in Russia on the train. We know exactly what's going on. We can certainly do that with their generals, and we can certainly do that with their tanks, their artillery, and their ships. And until they learn to defend against that, and I'm not sure that anyone has a doctrine to defend against that yet, I don't think we do, then that it will be easy for us to target some very specific targets. I think that's something that we all need to think about, that it's not just a matter of luck. Like, warfare has changed, technology has changed. We see this in almost every war. Someone thinks the war is going to go one way, and then they realize that there's a new technology and it's very different. Civil War, when repeating firearms came out, World War I, when belt-fed machine guns and artillery came out. You started out standing in line and running across open fields. That didn't work out. We had to change our tactics in Vietnam. We had to dumb it way down, because when you've got guys hiding in the jungle rather than fighting conventional forces like we were planning for, we weren't prepared for that. And I think that this is a change as well, with having a country like ourselves, Great Britain, Germany, other modern countries feeding Ukrainians who are fairly low-level technology, high-level technology information. We have slowed and stopped the Russian war machine. Russia's going to have to adapt to that. But My point being this. I wouldn't count them out yet. Give them a chance to adapt, see if they flop or see if they don't. But I think it's too early.
Hey,
Ralph?
great point, Bruce. Brent wanted me to jump in here about the naval perspective. Just for the background of the audience, I was a surface warfare officer for 9 years. I served on destroyers, deployed around Asia and the Middle East, and I was also a riverine officer. So I was never brass, but I was trained in a lot of the surface warfare. So as far as the Moskva sinking, I guarantee you that NATO or us or whomever used their extensive ISR assets to help out the Ukrainians. I can't confirm it. I'm just a civilian now, but I would not be surprised. Same thing with the LST that got killed in port. I don't know if you remember that before, but they had a landing ship that got blown up in port, and then his buddy was on fire heading out into the harbor. It was not a good look. And that happened because the Russians were bragging. All right. They put out on their version of Fox News or CNN or whatever. They're like, oh, look at us. We're unloading BTRs in port. The next day they blew up. And if you know anything about the logistics ships, they're crammed to the gills with arms, ammunition, fuel, things that explode. So it's not hard to take out ships in something as constrained as the Black Sea, especially when you're arrogant enough to stay within cruise missile range with a 1980s cruiser and not have your stuff up to date. A fellow former colleague of mine sent me, I can't confirm this, but it was a translated copy of some of the problems that the Moskva was going through before it came out. And it's not enough to have these terrifying looking ships, because believe me, the Chinese and Russians have some terrifying looking ships. Missiles everywhere, guns everywhere. They march really cool in the parades, whatever. But unless you maintain your ship, practice damage control, and maintain your casualty reports, your CAS reps, and keep things, your spare parts coming in and maintaining your weapon systems, your radar will not see the missile. And what happens when your radar doesn't see the missile? The Stark happens, all right? The British aluminum destroyers off the coast of the Falkland Islands happen, all right? Sailors die. Your billion-dollar warships go to the bottom of the ocean, and people look around and ask what happened. Like, why is my son dead? Why did my son get eaten by sharks or freeze to death in the South Atlantic? Well, because, unfortunately, even if you have very brave and capable sailors, if their equipment doesn't work, they're going to die. So it makes me wonder what the Chinese Navy has invested in damage control, has invested in, obviously maintaining their weapon systems. We don't know because it's a closed society. They have very impressive destroyers. The Renhai is terrifying. All right, from a former surface warfare officer. They have some very impressive ships that would be pretty difficult to take on paper. But how much experience do they have with logistics? How much experience do they have actually fighting and training with the ships? Is their training realistic? And also, are they able to absorb hits and still keep their operations going? That's one of the big things. And I think Les brought it up in one of the former streams. But if you want to look at how close run these things are, look at some of the documentaries on the Falkland Islands invasion. It was a very close run thing. All right. The British, by the skin of their teeth, won that war, but they could have lost to the Argentinians, which would have been very embarrassing. Rule Britannia, one of the greatest naval powers in history, being defeated by some second-rate, third-rate South American power. But with a few Mirage jets and Exocet cruise missiles, it almost happened. Argentina didn't lack for any bravery, and they didn't lack for trained equipment. It was just that the Brits were so well trained, and they were able to hold on to their fleet, even losing several ships, and still pursue that ground pounding invasion. But honestly, you could have the toughest soldiers, the toughest Marines. You can have guys with the high speed chest rigs and have really good split times with their mag reloads. It doesn't matter if they're starving on an island and their ships are at the bottom of the ocean. They're not going to be resupplied. They're going to starve to death, and they're going to banzai charge like the Japanese did, or they're just going to surrender. So the jury's out, but we'll see what happens to the Chinese if their ships are sinking in the strait, and a bunch of civilians that are heavily armed now are looking at a bunch of poorly supplied Chinese Marines sitting on the beach, wondering where their MREs are. But rant over. Thanks, guys.
I've actually got a question for you, Rob, and Les, you may chime in on this because you may know a little bit about it as well. But there are different types of warfare, and the most important between the U.S. and China, I would argue, is not military; it's economic, followed by technological. And it seems we've given the Chinese ground in these areas. So my question is, are we behind technologically? Are we behind economically? It seems our economies are so intertwined, especially in the private sector. They may have us by the balls in some sense.
I would say that the Chinese economy is very, very strong. They have done amazing things in the past 30 years, bringing themselves from poverty tier socialism to authoritarian capitalism mixed with socialism. And we've ceded a lot of the manufacturing to them because we just love cheap stuff. I mean, who doesn't like cheap tube socks? Who doesn't love Chinese body armor that may or may not stop bullets? I'm looking at some of the people in the audience. I know we've looked at it. But that being said, they still have a lot of endemic weaknesses. And I would recommend Peter Zeihan. He was the author of Accidental Superpower and a bunch of other books. Looking into the Chinese economy, they're integrated in the world, but honestly, they are much more dependent on globalism than even we are. We're dependent on globalism. Don't get me wrong. The American people are going to riot if they don't get their iPhones on time, if they don't get their their Gucci slides on time, etc. But we'll live. We can make food. All right. If we unscrew our politicians and really get to brass tacks, we can feed ourselves. We can fuel ourselves. The Chinese can't. They're already maxed out getting fuel from the Russians unless they expand the pipeline, which would take years to build. There's only so many ships in the world that will supply the Chinese, and they have arrested population that needs a lot of stuff. They need that oil. China has no oil. All right. They need a lot of those raw materials. China has some of them. China doesn't. That's why they're building, logistics bases in Africa for their Navy. Okay. If they were truly just worried about Taiwan and they were so secure in that, number one, they would have done it already. And number two, why are they so worried about courting all these African countries? It's because they need resources and they understand they're overextended. All right. So again, the Chinese are terrifying. They're very smart. Don't get me wrong. Technologically, they can copy things very, very well. But guess who could do that as well? The Japanese in World War II were good at doing that. They were good at reverse engineering stuff and even coming up with their own things like the Zero and the battleships and their aircraft carriers. They were able to build all of that. They were able to do it. But that doesn't mean that they had the economy and the resources to back a war of attrition. So I'll leave you with that. Now, do I think we should actually go to war with China and think that they're weak and they're 4 feet tall? That's not true either. Only a madman would say that. I really hope it never comes because a lot of my friends are going to die if that happens. A lot of Brent's friends are going to die if that happens. But you know what? They're not 10 feet tall either. Thank you.
Hey, Rob, quick question. We've heard a lot about, like Russian ships going to the bottom of the sea, not because of, a single cruise missile, but just because they couldn't stop the fire. And you mentioned damage control. If that's true, if you can enlighten us on that, what do you think China is on in their PLAN capabilities and, preventing fires and stuff like that? Because obviously leading up to the Ukrainian war, I would have thought that the Russian Navy is, first rate. And, they're just as well trained as our guys. But if that's the case, they're not able to prevent those fires and you have good damage control to salvage those ships. Is the Chinese, do you think, follow the Russian model in terms of training and capability?
I have no idea, Brent. I don't have any contacts over there. I couldn't tell you. They're reading the same history books we are. They understand it's important. I guarantee you some of their smarter guys, review what happened to the Stark, review what happened to the Antrim and the other British destroyers that took hits in the Falklands, etc. But, just because you have a handful of experts in any organization doesn't mean that it's going to spread all the way throughout the organization. The Japanese knew it was important, and they had a small cadre of damage control trained individuals. They usually got blown up by American 500-pound bombs, and then the rest of the crew was wondering what to do. Later on in the war, they tried to change the culture, but by then it was too little too late. So honestly, I'm not sure. And besides damage control, that's not the only thing. I mean, yeah, you'll save lives and you'll save the ship, but even if you save the ship, you can still get what's called in naval terminology, a mission kill. So even if you take a hit, ships aren't armored anymore. Chinese ships aren't armored. We're not armored. Unless we resurrect the Missouri and I go bribe somebody to get back into the military to go serve as the janitor. All right. We're not going to bring back armored ships. So basically, you have to shoot down the missile, distract the missile, seduce the missile, or kill the archer, so to speak, kill the launch platform before it kills you, or just be good enough to hide. And I won't get into that because that's classified, but be good enough to hide from enemy weapon systems. That's the main thing, because even if you do take a hit and you do heroic damage control and you keep yourself from sinking, your radar's full of holes, your computers are overheating, half your crew is blown up and burning to death. You're not going to be combat effective. You'll barely be able to limp back home. And, and I would argue that the same points our way too. Again, I talked about this in the last stream, but don't expect NATO forces to be impervious to this either. I would argue that we're pretty good and we take it very seriously, but you don't know until you're in the crucible of combat. And unfortunately, the Navy hasn't been in a big surface war since, you could argue the 80s, but that was like one day and we kicked the Iranians' asses. And before that, you could argue maybe really just World War II, because in Vietnam it was more short bombardment.
Yeah, I think the damage control aspect you're bringing up is highly important. And using two case studies here, one in the Falklands, you have the Sheffield, and then 5 years later in the Gulf, you have the Stark. In the case of the Sheffield, the warhead on the exoset didn't even explode. It was the unspent rocket fuel that started fires throughout the ship that they just couldn't control, which put that ship on the bottom of the ocean. Fast forward 5 years, and the Stark was hit not by one, but by two exosets, both warheads damaged. And if I remember correctly, most of the CIC was taken out, so a good portion of the leadership. Yet that ship, with assistance, was able to limp back to base and eventually be repaired and put back into service. So damage control is a big thing. And if the Chinese are not playing that game, they're going to take unsustainable losses really quickly. And I think to our side, damage control has always been important to the U.S. Navy, with the prime example that the Japanese were occupied by a lot of ships they thought they had put on the bottom of the ocean at the beginning of the war.
Excellent point. They say in the Marine Corps, every Marine is a rifleman, every sailor is a firefighter. It's not as sexy, but it's just as important.
Maybe that gets to a larger point that I was hoping we'd get to, and it's a bit of a segue, but I think it is very much related. And so that is, you said, Rob, the sex appeal part of it. Let's not kid ourselves. There is the sex appeal, and politicians, whether they're totalitarian regimes or oligarchies, whatever they are, and certainly democracies and republics as well, they tend to think of things that are very sexy. So let's give everybody in the United States Army and let's make sure everybody is a DMR, right? Because that's going to make things so much better. Sorry, that was a punch at the new M5. Anyway, getting back to the point here.
You mean the one we trashed this weekend? Sorry.
All right. What I'm trying to say is damage control, fire control on a ship is a pretty good analogy of a bigger issue, and that is logistics, the unsexy part of war. And I think if China takes anything away from this, we can talk about the lessons at the tactical level, and we enjoy doing that because it's so sexy to talk about, tanks and missiles and sex robots and things like that. Yes, I did. But at the operational level, here's the thing. Where is that? It's like the CONBLOC countries traditionally 20% of their strike force, 20% of their strike force is logistics. The US has 60% of its strike force that's logistics. Think about that again. So when you look at progress made in 1991 in the Persian Gulf War, in 2003 in the second invasion of Iraq, and we could look at other, we could look at Afghanistan for that matter, but we could look at Korea, we could look at Vietnam, we can look at World War II. I mean, America really seems to understand, and maybe it's because we are insular, maybe because as a nation we are protected by two big bodies of water, so that there was always the assumption if we go anywhere, we're going to have to take everything with us, enough, to feed the dog that we bring as a mascot. I don't know what it is about the American psyche. Maybe it's just that we're spoiled and we want all the creature comforts. I don't know. But what I do know is our strike force moved forward with 60% of the body being logistics. And The CONBLOC countries traditionally do not. They work with just 20%, and we can see how that's faring for them in Ukraine. So if China is learning a lesson from Ukraine, there's a very valuable one. Not just fire control on ships, but start paying attention to the unsexy stuff. There's the old adage, amateurs think of tactics, professionals think of logistics. I don't believe that's true, but it's an old adage,
It's a good point, Doc. I was just watching this. It was a book that was read out loud on YouTube, and I was sat through 12 hours of it about this guy that was in the German army and ended up in Latvia and was one of the last units to end up surrendering to the Russians well after Berlin had fallen. But it kind of went through his career. But he pointed out exactly that time, 75 years ago, what you're saying is that with Germany, they had about 3 support troops for every frontline troop, for every tanker, pilot, artilleryman, or infantryman. They had about 3 support troops to fuel that war machine. And Russia was the opposite. They had about 3 on the front lines for every support troop that they had on the logistical side. And maybe, that's still playing out a bit today. And that's why we're seeing poor training on things like firefighting and saving ships, repairing ships, keeping ships top notch. Same thing with planes, same thing with tanks. I just keep seeing, I'm always looking for similarities that are repetitive, and eventually something that's repetitive, you can start to say, okay, I believe this is becoming a trend. This is becoming something that the military is doing. I mean, they're having tanks that are tracked and the crews are just leaving the tanks. They're having tanks that run out of fuel and the crews are just leaving the tanks. I can't imagine that being something that the U.S. would do. And even with Germany in World War II, when that happened to them, they would spike the tank. They're not even spiking the tanks, and I don't know why, but they're not, and rather letting them fall into the hands of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians now are claiming to have captured about 200 armored vehicles that took very minor repairs or a simple fuel can to get them up and running and drive back into the Ukrainian lines. Not sure how, exactly accurate that is, but we can all agree that there's definitely some that's happening to, because the Ukrainians are constantly running around showing videos of really cool new vehicles that they've captured from the Russians that appear to be in really good shape. And they're like, hey, look, we got this new thing over here. We got this new thing over there. So I don't know, man. You got me thinking on the logistical side. That may be a huge key to warfare that's not glorious. People don't really want to pay attention to, but it makes or breaks a military.
Oh, absolutely. As the career logistician here, let me throw my 3 cents in worth. The scary thing is, compared to the time of Doc and I when we served, U.S. logistics capabilities are a shadow of themselves. But saying that, they're still way better than everybody else's. If the UN decides to go somewhere, unless the U.S. decides to move them or they contract it out to civilians, they're not going anywhere. Nothing goes anywhere in NATO unless we provide the transportation. And that's a fact. You look at the one thing the U.S. Air Force does way above and beyond any other Air Force on this planet, and that's airlift for supplies. That's what it does better than everybody else. Nobody else holds a candle to it. Our airlift, we probably have more C-17s than most Air Forces have planes in total. And that's about as unsexy as it goes. And the other thing is, we like our logistics. When the Air Force buys planes, every year they buy C-130s. And it gets through the budget. It's not a disputed item. They're going to buy some. They're going to argue this year about how many F-35s they're going to buy versus how many F-15s, and should they upgrade the MX missile, and should they fund this new program. But they're going to say we need X amount of C-130s, and they're going to get them. Nobody's going to argue that shouldn't be in the budget. Whereas, say, the Royal Air Force, their transport planes, they probably haven't bought one in a few years, and the ones that they have were probably more of a government subsidy jobs program than any wants or needs of the RAF. And I would say that holds for just about every other Air Force on this planet, with the odd exception of the New Zealand Air Force that has no combat aircraft and only airlift aircraft.
Hey guys, I highlighted this comment. I know this isn't exactly pertaining to what Les just got done talking about, but I just wanted to point this out. So I recently just left my current Marine Corps unit, which was out of Oklahoma. And a lot of those Oklahoma guys I've been talking to over the past year since I've been there have been telling me that, Oklahoma has legalized marijuana. And they told me that the Chinese are buying farmland out the ass there. They're just buying it up left and right. And they're putting marijuana farms, grow farms there. And they're just capitalizing on this. So just be cognizant here that the Chinese government is buying farmland. This guy that posted this is 100% accurate, at least from the multiple Marines that live in Oklahoma have told me this. So it's just something to think about. Like they're going full spectrum warfare. They're not just focused in on one aspect. We're sitting here talking about, when they're going to move on Taiwan. And just like Rob has already pointed out, they've got their tentacles in Africa, South America. Like they are full scale war against us. It's just a Cold War. We don't have rounds flying at each other yet. We don't have missiles flying at each other yet. They're beating us economically, and they're buying up our own fucking land in our own country across the nation, right underneath our noses. So, FYI.
Well, just you talk about having them having tentacles everywhere. I mean, look at the influence they have on Hollywood and the NBA. An NBA player speaks out against, what's going on with the Uyghurs, and he gets smacked down by the NBA. So they do have a lot of influence here. It's kind of scary.
And Chad, go back to the second Red Dawn movie that was absolute garbage. By the way, guys, don't watch it. But same thing. I mean, that goes pretty far back. And the Chinese threw a fit that it was going to be about China, and they ended up making it about North Korea. That's the power that they had. And someone in chat threw out the word subversion. That's exactly right. They're doing it anywhere they can. It's not just the United States, but they're certainly doing it in the United States. I don't blame them. I blame us for allowing it to happen.
Well, you're right, Bruce, but I don't care if they buy land, because you know what? Tomorrow we can write a law that says that land's not yours and give it back, or take it and make it government property. The U.S. kind of has a history of taking people's land. You can take it in a heartbeat. They can't pick up land and take it back to China. They can shut down a factory and cause a problem, but okay, you can't take your Hollywood studio to China. So you want to buy something here? Fine. Just realize, I'll take it. And
I don't think it's as simple as the physical land. I agree with that completely. You just go take it back, kick them off. But I think about it this way, Art. If they've got this land and they're growing a product on that land, and they're growing a product that Americans want and Americans are purchasing, then when you take that product away, they're going to throw a damn fit. We could do the same thing. We could go tomorrow and say no more iPhone importations. Done. Over. You can only have an American-made smartphone starting tomorrow. Whoever comes up with that idea will be drug out behind a horse tomorrow, because people aren't going to go for it, because there's no good American-made cell phones and there's none to supply the need that we have. So you get enough people smoking weed and on weed and wanting that weed supply that China's got. It's not the land itself that they've got their tentacles in. It's the supply of the product that they have Americans hooked on that Americans are going to want. And that becomes hard, because at that point, when you go, okay, we're going to go and we're going to take this land away from the Chinese, then everybody's going to say, where's my weed coming from?
Oh, okay. You can just say, okay, now, Billy Joe Jim Bob, you're a weed farmer. Mm-hmm.
Well, see that's sort of the argument with Taiwan and the computer chips. A lot of people are like, why are we making them over there? Why don't we just make them over here? Because it takes time to get spooled up to do that, and we aren't capable of doing it as good as they are right now. That's our own fault for promoting trade amongst other countries. We've created this situation for ourselves, but we've also got to wean ourselves off of it. It's no different for Europe with Russian oil, right? They're now in a tough situation where they're saying, we don't like Russia anymore. We don't really want to buy oil from them, but we got to get this oil from somewhere, and everybody wants it. So what are we going to do? And it's going to take them a while and a lot of pain and heartache before they're at a point that they're able to find it from other sources and completely fill that void that Russia's going to leave.
Hey, great point, Brent and Bruce. I'd also say the Chinese fentanyl coming up from Mexico is pretty damn terrifying as well. That stuff's getting laced in a lot of the drugs. The Chinese know that we have a drug problem in the U.S., up and down the socioeconomic ladder. And it's almost like a reverse opium war, just more underground. So it is pretty terrifying. And if you look at a lot of the stuff, like Chad was mentioning, the Thousand Talents program, their tentacles are everywhere. Okay, you don't need to look far to see a news article talking about some Chinese person being deported from one of our top technical or educational research facilities or colleges, universities, because they were feeding information back to China. All right, it's a thing. They send people here in deep cover or whatever. As far as the larger geopolitical struggle between America and China, I'm in Brent's category. Like, that is going to be the real contest of the next century, and we'll see what the world decides. I mean, do you want authoritarianism, basically? I mean, that's what China is. I mean, yeah, they're also communist, but they're mainly authoritarian in my book, because they'll do some capitalist stuff if that gives them more power. Or do they want some sort of liberal democracy? And you're already starting to see the culture war here. I see it in the comments and stuff. I don't want to get too political. Obviously I have my own opinions, but the greater world is fighting against authoritarianism right now. There's no reason why people would want to care about Ukraine. Now, I understand people are mad about Ukraine. Ukraine had a lot of corruption. I understand that. The average Ukrainian doesn't want to live under Putin's boot. And that's why I root for them as the underdog. Now, do I think America should give all its blood and treasure to Ukraine? No. But I don't mind us supporting them, bogging down the Russians so that we can focus on the Chinese. That being said, it doesn't mean that I think we need to launch a first strike on the Chinese like a bunch of morons and start World War III for no reason, nor do I think we should start World War III with Russia for no reason. That's why I didn't support the no-fly zone over Ukraine, even though all those videos being streamed of Ukrainian babies blowing up definitely tugged at my heartstrings, especially as a new father. But that being said, war is terrible. If you want peace, prepare for war. And we need to focus on that. I will say, jumping on back to the whole Taiwan topic, a lot of naval warfare, just like land warfare, is training and logistics, just like Doc was talking about. Professionals worry about the logistics and train. That's why the Navy's expensive. That's why we need to hold our politicians accountable for buying stupid ships. Buy the good ships, buy the what we know works, and make sure that our sailors have enough gas, bullets, and live fire exercises to make sure that they're better, and the Chinese have no question that we are better than them, that the Japanese are better than them, and maybe one day even the South Koreans are better than them. All right, the Ukrainians are much smaller than the Russians. On paper, they should have been knocked over in 2 weeks. The similarities between China and Taiwan are, before the war, before February 2022, were very similar. But you know what? The Ukrainians are still fighting. I think if the Taiwanese manage to buck up and defend themselves and embarrass the Chinese Navy in the Strait, they'll gain more and more public support, and the Chinese will become more and more ostracized from a globalized system that, again, read Peter Zahan, they can't afford to decouple from. Because if they do, their population is going to get very angry, and they're going to have far bigger problems at home than they are trying to get their, highly motivated, but maybe not the best soldiers across the strait alive. All right. Russia ran out of gas and bullets 48 hours into an invasion of an adjacent country with good roads. The Chinese have to get their troops across 100 miles of ocean alive and take Taipei. And it's up to the Taiwanese whether or not they're gonna let them do that. And then we'll see what the rest of the world does after that.
Rob, let me follow us up a question for any of you guys really that may know. I mean, we kind of talk about China having to cross a body of water to get to Taiwan and how difficult, challenging that might be. So Russia only had to cross a line in the sand to drive into Ukraine. We saw it happening. We knew it was happening months before it happened. We allowed it to happen. And then we left the Ukrainians. Well, we kind of would wait and see what would happen. And when we were kind of caught by surprise and surprised that the Ukrainians were actually fighting back and slowing them down, we realized, hey, maybe we want to get involved. We might could actually have a chance at defeating Russia on this. But looking at it in the Taiwanese perspective, do we even have the capabilities? Does Taiwan even have the capabilities that if tomorrow China started loading ships and started getting everything they needed to prepare to do a land invasion on Taiwan, are they capable of stopping that from happening right now and not waiting 2 months to get involved and react?
Sorry to jump in again. Absolutely, they do. All right. Shore-based cruise missiles, the Ukrainians have proven that slightly upgraded Soviet Harpoonskis, or the kayak from the 80s, all right, can still sink the flagship of the Russian fleet. All right. The Taiwanese have the same thing. They have better. We can supply them with better if we're smart. They have excellent air defense. All right. And the Chinese will have to operate feet wet over water over a longer distance. So if you get hit, if you take a hit over Taiwan, you know, the jury's out on whether or not you'll be able to make it back across the strait or parachute into the water. All right. It's a lot scarier to do naval operations. There's so much that can go wrong, even when people aren't shooting at you. If you look at the history of the lead up to the D-Day invasion, the lead up to the invasions of Tarawa, we lost hundreds of Marines and soldiers training for the invasion without ever actually having real shots fired at us. All right. Or having a submarine take us out when we were just training. I will say that the lead up to take an island the size of Taiwan, we're going to see it on the satellite picture. It's not something that it can be done, you know, super secretly. I saw a comment earlier of a bunch of unmarked merchant ships with Connex boxes full of missiles. All right, we don't live in James Bond. All right, there's no Dr. Doom in some mountain that has a bunch of secret missiles. All right, that definitely they definitely have caliber programs that they use to sell missiles, and they can do that. But the logistics and the spin up and the build up for a full scale invasion of an island nation, it's going to be hard for the United States not to notice, and it's going to be hard for the Taiwanese not to notice, because I guarantee you the Taiwanese have spies inside the Chinese Navy. All right, so a lot of people are going to die trying to assault that island if the Taiwanese have the balls to actually fight, and if they have enough weapon systems to take out those ships before they hit the beach, and if they have the will to fight when if they do carry on the fight inland. Air defense is a different story. I'm not exactly spun up on how much Taiwan has invested in air defense, but I'd be buying Stingers and SAMs and radars like nobody's business if I were Taiwan.
Well, if China's Air Force is anything like Russia's, and the thing we've learned in the last few months is that air power is not that effective by itself. There are two things going on that we've seen in Ukraine. One, Russia needs the ability to fly relatively low, below 10,000 feet, to get good hits on its ground targets. It can't do that because we've got those Stinger missiles and other man pads all over the place that threaten anything below 10,000 feet. And if they have to fly above 10,000 feet, well, they're not very accurate with their targeting, and they're not doing a very good job of getting the targets that they want to do. And I wonder if maybe the same thing may be happening in Taiwan. Again, Taiwan needs a good air defense system. They should have capabilities for both. But if they're not getting troops on the ground, I don't expect their Air Force to be that effective.
I did read an article talking about how Taiwan was complaining about Stingers being backed up at the U.S. factory. So that signals to me, open source, that Taiwan is taking it very seriously. And, honestly, their drills are very serious, too. They're calling up their reservists. I read an article talking about how a Taiwanese general was looking at Ukraine and thinking, you know what, we don't need to just spend all our money on our active duty guys. If we have decently trained, motivated reservists, we can have a bunch of capabilities spread out, arm these guys really quick with a bunch of Stingers and a bunch of Javelins, and have a nice surprise waiting at the invasion beaches, if you know what I mean. So the reservists are definitely kind of something that I think the Taiwanese and the Chinese are looking at out of the Ukraine war. And they're definitely trying to buy up Stingers. But Stingers, like you said, are just a partial solution. They're below 10,000 feet. The advanced air defense systems, the Aegis ships from Japan coming in to help them out, those are far more powerful, all right? Just one Aegis ship in the region that can be adequately defended and use its tricks of the trade, so to speak, to stay out of the gun sights of the Chinese, can do a lot against the Chinese Air Force. And it only takes so many only children getting blown out of the sky before Chinese civilians start wondering why the hell they're wasting their lives in Taiwan.
Yeah, I'll tell you that one other thing, and then I'll let everybody else step in. But it seems that the Harpoonski is very popular among chat tonight. So I would suggest that we get all of the Taiwanese people that live on the coast, as well as all Ukrainians, at least one Harpoonski each.
Well said, Bruce. Well said. Rob, question for you. The Taiwanese Navy, while they do seem to do a very good job of upgrading it, the hulls seem to be old. I think when I looked at their last order of battle, they still have some World War II class subs in service actively. Do you think they would benefit greatly if we transferred them some of the early model Flight 1 Arleigh Burkes, even though they're coming to the end of their service life?
I don't know too much about their subs, but I do know that their advanced destroyers were the old Ayatollah classes that were meant in the 80s or late 70s to go to the Iran, but then they, had their revolution, so we transferred them to Taiwan. They wasted money on some big, expensive amphibious landing ship, and they have a few Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates and some indigenous stuff. But I'm not sure what the Taiwanese Navy was thinking buying a landing ship. I think that was more a propaganda coup than anything practical. If I were them, I'd invest in air defense and anti-submarine warfare, and probably a lot of cheap expendable missile boats. I was a riverine officer, and I truly believe in the sea version of guerrilla warfare. And if you have a bunch of small boats, the Chinese have this, but if you have a bunch of small boats with anti-ship cruise missiles and they come out of small islands and unexpected coves and stuff, they can do what the PT boats did to the Japanese and the Solomons. It just depends on how well you use them.
Well, to go down a rabbit hole there, what do you think is the best missile patrol craft these days out there on the market?
That's a good question. I haven't read too much on it. I'd have to get back to you, but I know the Swedes make some pretty interesting, basically what the LCS should have been. They have some pretty cool jet boats that Taiwan could look into. And I know Taiwan already has some missile boats in their inventory. But those alone won't win the war. They'll definitely attrite, though, and they'll be useful. And if you lose them, so what? A few guys get martyred. That sucks. They go. Sucks for those families. But 4 guys getting blown up in a missile boat while taking out a Chinese destroyer or a Chinese landing ship is a pretty fair trade as far as a war goes.
And see, it's interesting that you mentioned the Swedes because now that they're looking to join NATO, and that may be happening soon, maybe we can get some good trade deals going with some of those ships. I'll tell you, what are you guys' opinion? I know this was brought up in previous chats, and it's more, at least for me, and maybe it's more relevant now than it was even just a few weeks ago. The more that I get spooled up on this, but we have a NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for European countries around the North Atlantic. But is it time? Do we need something like that for the theater around Taiwan, China, Japan?
We do. We have it. CETO. Southeast.
Yeah, CETO's not what it used to be, Doc. Mm-hmm.
No, it's not. And it's no longer called CETO, let me be clear. But Southeast Asia Treaty Organization goes all the way back to, I think, the end of 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. But I forget what it's called. We just call them the Pacific, East Pac Islands or allies, whatever it is. I'm sorry. There's an acronym out there. It's been upgraded, but it's still the same concept. And it's the big players we've already named. It's Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, and then, of course, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand. These were the main players. There's lesser members too that kind of go in and out. You might argue that Philippines is one of those. Indonesia. There's some others in there, but there is a pact. However, as the other panelists on this board have said, Bruce, is to remember that the NATO pact, for the most part, is, it's a continent, right? They're not islands. They're not separated by large bodies of water. So I'm not just talking about logistics here. I'm saying if one country falls and it's it has a contiguous borders with other countries. This is, I think, a bigger concern, and so it makes the pact more a pact. After all, is just a promise, which is pretty abstract, and it reifies that pact. It says, "Oh, hey, man, we share a common border with our antagonist, and we like each other, so let's make sure we help each other." You just don't have that when you're saying, well, us people down here in Indonesia are closely associated with people in South Korea. Yeah. Not really, you aren't. So
No.
it's just not as strong.
Talking about allies there, I want to kind of shift a little bit. Les, you brought up India earlier, and I kind of want to talk about India. I think prevention is the best approach in all this. So maybe there's an indirect approach to this problem. China has enemies on the borders. We've talked about Japan. We've talked about South Korea. Les mentioned India. One of the major failures, I think, of American diplomacy involves the erosion of our relations with India. I read a recent article on The Hill that after the invasion of Ukraine, our relations have kind of soured. But India has had border wars with China for the past couple decades. The most recent one was last year in eastern Ladakh, and both are nuclear powers. Their armed forces are actually pretty comparable according to the Global Power Index. China's third, India's fourth. I don't think it would hurt to strengthen our relations with Delhi or even offer economic incentives to our own businesses to do business with India. So maybe the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Well, Chad, if I can jump in there and I'll say, think about the economic growth too. It's not that China doesn't have a long way to go. And so what I'm saying is if the cup is only, 40% full and you go, wow, we can make profit on the other 60%. In India, I would argue the cup is, not 40% full, but maybe 25% full. And so if that's a little abstract, sorry. The point is that you're right. I've wondered for, the better part of a decade now, why don't we have better ties with India? Why don't we give India trade preferences, preferential treatment that we do with China? And I say this for several reasons. As you've said, Chad, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Sure, there's some of that, but also it's that India isn't, I'm sure they have spy networks. I'm sure they're, at different times antagonistic or at least, blasé about America's foreign investments and foreign concerns, right? What I'm saying is we don't always see eye to eye with them. But India doesn't have a history of being hostile to the United States of America, whereas China has a long history of being hostile and us to them. So why wouldn't we reach out to the second largest populous nation in the world, one that's still a developing nation and much in need of, economic support? This one strikes me as odd. Why not?
Yeah, this all makes perfect sense.
Okay.
India has a very long history, i.e. since 1947 when they became a nation, of making really stupid military decisions, especially in procurement and logistics. And I'll give you their big recent one. Rob, I'd love to get your opinion on this. They just bought an aircraft carrier from the Russians, got royally screwed in the deal. It's crappy in its capabilities, flies low quality planes. On the other side, the United States was going, hey, buy enough planes to fill it. We'll give you the Kitty Hawk. And they went, now it's old. Anybody want to compare the old U.S. Kitty Hawk to anything anybody else has and go, their shit's better? No, that's just an example of Indian stupidity. When they have good military equipment, it's because whoever that was selling it to them paid the best bribe that day. They make crappy military decisions. And when they fight Pakistan and they fight each other to a stalemate, India usually outnumbers Pakistan massively. And yet they don't perform. We think our politics are incredibly screwed up here in America. One of the things we don't have here in America is what they have in India, where a political party in one state, the exact same political party in the other state will sabotage each other. Generally, Virginia Republicans work pretty well with North Carolina Republicans and other such things. Not in India. And just because hey, I can do business in Mumbai. Don't think you can go do the same business over in Bangalore. Here in America, if I want to do business in Virginia, it's like, hey, I need to be doing business in Texas. No one cares. Everybody thinks it's a great idea. You know, if I want to go do business in California, people think I've lost my freaking mind, and maybe I would have, but there's nothing to stop me from doing it. And I would do business in California the same way I do it in Virginia, not in India. Just because you do something one way in Calcutta, you are not going to do it that way down in Trivandrum.
All right. So what you're saying is both of them are caste societies, wickedly caste societies. But the difference is that China has one power. So if you get in your economic, favor with the single power in a caste society, you have more success than trying to have to win each one of the oligarchs over in India, because it's a caste society, but no one single entity is in power. If that's what I'm hearing you say, does that sound about right, Les?
Yeah, but they also have all the inefficiencies of a communist system. Like, for a great example, when the Arleigh Burke class destroyer came out, that's the mainstay of our fleet. We've produced probably 70, 80 of them. When we're done with the production run, we'll have made it well over 100 at the rate things are going. The Indians came out at the same time with their Mysore class. In the same amount of time, they managed to rack up a whopping 4.
It's interesting what you say, Les. I don't know too much about Indian politics. Oh, look, there's my avatar. But I don't know about Indian politics, but I do know that the Russian carrier that they do have in service is like a punishment tour. The bathrooms don't work. It has to go to sea with an ocean-going tug. It's always belching black smoke, which is not a good thing. Basically, if you screw up in the Russian Navy, they send you to I think the Admiral Kuznetsov or whatever it's called. It's not a fun time. The Indians have always played the fence between the Cold, in the Cold War, and they ended up buying a lot of Russian equipment. So I'm wondering if they're just worried about backwards compatibility. Not that an infantryman has much to do with an aircraft carrier, but maybe they're just like, okay, just use what we know. American equipment is the best, but it also comes with a price tag, and it also comes with a lot of training and spare parts that are very expensive. So maybe that's what they were thinking. But hey, if you want to fight the war on the cheap, be prepared to trade a lot of lives. You're going to pay in either ships or men or both. That being said, as far as the Indians go, yeah, I think they're definitely an ally worth looking at. But they're always going to they're going to mainly look out for themselves. They're far enough removed. And then going back to what Doc said about Asia, that's pretty true too. My background is Asian, and you know what? They generally don't want to be gobbled up by China one by one, but it's not like Europe where Poland is literally right next door and can hear the bombs as the Ukrainians are getting bombed. All right, it's not going to be like that between Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia. The Philippines, as I mentioned before, they may be electing a president, I think, where they're going to be a little more pro-China, unfortunately. So we'll see how that develops, even though I think the average Filipino is very much pro-American. Old Filipinos love MacArthur, for example. So we'll see what happens. And if you want to look at history books and whatnot, depicting a lot of the naval struggle, I'd recommend, because I'm motivated by Chad. Chad always recommends books in the streams. I recommend 100 Days by the admiral who invaded the Falkland Islands successfully. That's a pretty hit and run story there, so I think that's fascinating. And Neptune's Inferno, that's talking about the Guadalcanal campaign and how, there's always that legend of the Marines being left behind on Guadalcanal by the Navy. I'm sorry to say that we lost a lot of ships trying to defend you all, and we eventually came back, but it was a hard won thing. We got our butts kicked early in World War II, and we lost a lot of cruisers that shouldn't have been lost. Because the Japanese, they knew what they were doing. And that's what, depresses me a little bit about a future war too, is our Arleigh Burkes are beautiful. I served on one. I'm so proud of the U.S. Navy. We have to prepare ourselves if we do go down the road of war to see those billion-dollar ships and 300 men dying and not being able to rescue them. We might, hopefully we'll be able to, but it's pretty far from home, and the American people have to wrap their heads around that. We're pretty used to low intensity conflict and low casualty numbers.
something to think about in terms of India. In terms of backwards compatibility and them being in bed with the Russians on military equipment. They've kind of been that way all along. They like to produce stuff in-house. They don't design anything. But if you guys think about the FAL, when they were, or before that, the British Enfield, they produced those in-house. You can buy an Indian-made Enfield. You can buy an Indian-made FAL. And if you've got the money, you can buy an Indian-made T-72. The T-72 became their main battle tank. They went to Russia. They said, we don't want to buy yours. We want to build them here. Just send us your prints and your engineers, and we'll turn out our own version. They started doing the same thing with the T-90, but they found out that although the T-90 looks like a somewhat upgraded, modified T-72, it's a little more complicated than that. But that's what's going on with India. They like to produce it in-house. Maybe they think they can do it cheaper. Surely they don't think they can do it better. But it gives them control over the manufacturing, maybe if something were to fracture with the country. But I'm telling you, I got a solution to this, guys. I got this all figured out. In terms of getting India on board, getting all Indians on board, you guys keep talking about how corrupt India is. That's perfect for America. We freaking love corrupt countries. That's why we love Ukraine. Because all you got to do to get a corrupt person on your side or a corrupt group on your side is offer them money. So here's what you do. You go to India, you go to all different groups. You say, here's what you're going to do. You say, you're going to shut down your freaking call centers. You're going to quit calling the United States tomorrow. And if you do that, every American will take down that stupid Ukrainian flag off their Instagram post, and that Indian flag will be up there. We'll be behind them. $40 million for India. Support them 100%. Guys, if you can get rid of those call centers, I'm already on board. I'll spend my tax money, and I'll vote to spend your tax money to shut it down.
Well, how do you follow that? Now, back on the India thing, I mean, they have all the potential in the world. They have the manpower. They do try to manufacture their own stuff, but it seems like countries with a lot of people can't manufacture good war equipment because the Chinese manufacture a lot of crap too. You know, it probably scares China in a certain way, but the Chinese probably look at the Indians going, well, there's a lot of mountains between us and them, and we're not that worried about it. Navally, neither power can really get into the other's waters. You know, while India probably is winning the aircraft carrier war, they are better than the Chinese by a skosh. They couldn't go off China and sustain and do anything. And the same thing, the Chinese couldn't go sit off the Indian coast and do anything. So if you're India, there's probably no real advantage to be a big ally of the U.S. because you've got parity with your neighbor. You can hold him at an arm's length.
Well, guys, we might be reaching culmination here on this topic. So, you know, if you guys got any saved rounds on this, we might be able to wrap this up. Maybe take some questions from the audience and call it the night. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'll. Are we going to go around before we go to the next topic? Is what I guess I should ask.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
Let's start with Pegasus test. Go ahead.
All right. Well, since we got our naval expert with us, Rob, what's your general impression of the state of the fleet these days with the debacle of LCS and the Zumwalt being a kind of a bit of a disaster too, to say the least?
I would say that we have egg on our face and we need to take a long, hard look in the mirror and realize that we don't have infinite money. We don't have infinite money to fight ISIS in the desert. And believe me, I said on the last stream, I was proud that my strike group killed a bunch of ISIS guys. Super proud. That's not going to do anything against the Chinese. We got to realize that we don't have infinite funds. The American taxpayer is pissed off that everything's more expensive, that inflation is up, and we have to do more with the money we have. So that means that we buy the ships and the missiles and the weapon systems and the training dollars and the fuel to be better than the Chinese. They may have more ships, but we have to be better, quantitatively and qualitatively. We have to be better. We may not be able to have as many as them, but we can have more of the ships that matter. So a lot of it is, going back to the former stream, a naval war is a building war. The decisions we make now in 2022 will pay dividends for, hopefully. I don't want my kid to be fighting this war down the line. But if he does, I want him to have the best ships ever, the best ships for the job, so to speak.
All right. On that note, do you think we're right sized right now, or does the fleet numbers need to go up and go back to being a 15 carrier battle group Navy?
I would say yes, because deployment cycles are pretty long. I would argue that the 9-month deployments are going to burn out a bunch of your qualified people. So if we can maintain strength, maybe not parity, but strength in the in 7th Fleet, with the numbers that allow for that, and maybe I'd say maybe a 7-month deployment. I think that's a good point. We're not going to be able to get back to the 6-month deployments that my father's generation enjoyed during the Cold War with the 600 ship fleet, but maybe we can stay with a 7-month deployment, and that won't burn out your trained and motivated personnel. All these 9 and 10-month deployments, you're going to burn out good people.
And what is a 9 and 10-month deployment doing to a ship? Because I'm got to be sure that availability time now is way less than it used to be back in the Cold War.
It's a big caterpillar effect. All of it affects, and it goes down the supply chain. Another thing we need to do is try to encourage the trades. We don't have enough shipyard workers. We need to drop this stigma of everybody has to go to college. You know what? A good welder, a good pipe fitter, a good electrician is worth its weight in gold, especially when we need to start making weapons platforms faster and not just ships.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to see a bigger fleet because I'd like to use the World War II analogy. And if you look at all the big capital ships there, the aircraft carriers, the battleships, everyone that actually fought in World War II was already on the drawing boards. Congress had already said, we'll pay for that before Pearl Harbor happened. And after Pearl Harbor, they were very prolific with the funding for ships, and that made a big difference. But the carriers and the battleships and all that, all the ones that served were all planned before December 7th. And I think if we don't start building now, we're going to get bit hard because the state of the reserve fleet, unlike in the Second World War, is just non-existent through, I believe, 2 bad decisions. One, of just getting rid of it because we don't want to pay for it. And 2, block obsolescence, is that we reached a point we cannot maintain those older systems, and that upgrading them just wasn't worth the squeeze. Would you agree or disagree with that, Rob?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I definitely agree. And it's funny, I feel bad. I feel like I'm taking over the stream. So my apologies, guys. I'll try to keep this short. But yeah, you need to have the right equipment. You have to have the shipyard facilities ready to go for maintenance, and you have enough qualified workers. These things can't be pulled out of whoever occupies the White House. They can't pull it out of his butt or her butt. All right. You need to have the industrial capability and the technical expertise and the workers able to build what we need. And again, this is preparing for a war I hope never happens, but you can't just magic a ship. You can raise companies of men and send them out to go fight and die, and a bunch of them are going to die, but they can still take and hold land. You can't magic a ship out of nothing.
Right, I've talked long enough. Chad, what you got, buddy?
I guess I'll just kind of conclude with this. Do I think Ukraine has influenced China? Surely China is watching and taking notes, but I don't think the ambitions have gone away. We need to keep pressure on China, both internally and externally, by any means necessary. If anything, it will at least buy time for Taiwan to prepare further. They've been preparing, and we'll probably have early warning. Not to mention, some of you guys have said that the PLA hasn't really been combat tested in several decades. So that's kind of some obstacles that China has to overcome. But China's waging an all-out war with us, an all-out Cold War with us, I should say, economically, politically, technologically, and most importantly, culturally. I read an article detailing that the CCP is now claiming anybody that criticizes them is racist. So you can tell they're watching American news media and how the CRT and all this other crap is infiltrating our society. And now we can claim racism, and the world will see it our way. So they're definitely watching us. They see how politically divided we are. So we kind of have to, I think, deal with that before we start looking at Taiwan. So.
All right. Yeah. So back to the original question: has China changed its mind due to the war in Ukraine? And we've discussed, we've touched on tactics, operation, and strategy. And very much appreciate Rob being with us this evening because, of course, he's bringing the Navy element, the naval element to it, which is an aspect that's often missing from this panel. So I appreciate that. And I think we did go into the logistics a fair amount. I'll say that we keep dipping our toe back into the tactical perspective. And I'd say, regardless, whether you're talking tactics, operations, or strategy, the biggest thing I'll call to mind, and I think I think China is very much aware of this, in spite of the fact that Western news media doesn't seem to be aware of it. And that is this: that when it comes to defense versus offense, the tie goes to the runner. Defense is the stronger position versus, every military. I mean, seriously, it is. It's the stronger position of the two: Clausewitzian, Sun Tzu, Jomini, everyone. And so I mention that because when it comes to the tactical level, I believe China is not going to be impressed that there are 500 tanks destroyed. Main battle tanks, and they shouldn't be, because if they're amazed by that, then hello, welcome to warfare. You're a novice. I don't think China will be shocked that, oh my gosh, there's a lot of jet fighters shot down. Once again, you're a novice if you thought your jet fighters weren't going to get shot down. So there's a lot of things at a tactical level that are wowee on live stream. Live stream too, but I mean on Live Leak and YouTube and news media and social media. Wowee, look at this rifle. Wowee, look at this tank. Wowee, look at this aircraft or manpad or rocket launcher or whatever it is. And for me, that's, yeah, okay. Wowee. Yes, humans die in war. So maybe that's the bigger lesson. At a, and I'm talking again at a tactical level. I'm going to wait for assessment on that. Is the T-72 better than the T-90? Let's have this discussion in 6 years when we have the data in front of us, okay? So I think China's probably looking at that at a tactical level. We've already discussed the operational level, and I think we did that pretty well. So my last comment then would be on the strategic level. And I'm going to say this. When your nation has lost that many aircraft, lost naval ships, lost 500 main battle tanks, and God knows how many armored vehicles and wheeled vehicles, when they've lost 15,000 killed in action and somewhere upward of 30 to 40,000 wounded in action, then you have to conclude one thing. If your nation is attacking another nation and it's taken all those losses and you're still in the fight, you're committed. And so here's what China is watching. What will be the strategic outcome of this? Because Russia's committed. And while they've had many, many mistakes and half steps along the way, they still seem to be winning. So what's going to happen at that level? Also, China's got to be looking at the strategically at the economic responses. So once again, I brought it up earlier. This is odd that such a regional fight has gotten such global outrage and global commitment, at least in terms of materials. So that's something that they should look at. And if I can add just one more thing, not about China, but about everyone else in the world, all the neighbors of the world need to look at this and take a strategic lesson here as well. And that is the question, is military spending, after all, so expensive? Or is it an expense that you can budget year in and year out? And that's a weird question, but juxtapose that question to this one. Which is more expensive? A set budgetary amount for military spending and keeping up a robust military, or rebuilding all of your cities. So that's my take on this one. And let's see if China does change its mind. I think we need to learn the lessons just as much as China does.
Such a good point on the spending side, Doc. And it's something that Chad has been talking about pretty much so all night, off and on. The question being, can we, well, just think about this. I was looking at the numbers. I mentioned this earlier, but I was looking at the numbers. We were spending about $50 billion a year in Afghanistan. As soon as we get out of Afghanistan, what happens? Ukraine. And how much money did they just ask for? $40 billion. Guys talk about the military industrial complex and the huge appetite that it has. And I agree. And maybe this might sound a little bit socialist in a way, but I mean, I do believe that when it comes to democracy and a republic, the sort of exception to that is our military. Our military doesn't really answer to democracy. Generals don't go out and take a vote among their troops as to who wants to go over the top of the trench, and we don't really finance it that way or think of it that way. It's that one organization, if you will, where your rights are kind of put aside for this kind of greater good idea or mission idea. And I sort of wonder, when we're talking about spending money, you know, we spend this people are talking about spending $40 billion. Well, that's $40 billion that Americans are making somewhere. Some worker, he's building that javelin. He's building that artillery piece. And if we're giving them old stuff, we're building new stuff to replace it. We're talking about building ships. That's going to cost a whole lot of money. That's going to be lots of billions, guys. And that's going to create jobs, though. You're going to have that guy out there that's having to rivet that ship together, weld it together, cut the sheet metal, do all the electronics, get that thing up and running, all the engine work. So I kind of wonder, is it such a bad thing? And I think the bigger picture is this. People have said this before. I'm not the first one, but if we can fight a proxy war, our own people aren't dying. And more importantly, our own cities aren't getting bombed. As long as our cities aren't getting bombed, can we afford to supply equipment to other countries? And I think that we can. I think we're a rich nation and that we can do that. And I'll just wrap it up with this, because this question kept getting brought up by some of you too. Some of you were sort of complaining, hey, we could take that money and we could spend that money on the border. No, guys, we can't and we won't. The United States has had since 1776 to solve its border problem. We're at more of a crisis now than we've ever been. The U.S. government is not your answer when it comes to immigration issues. The U.S. government is not going to, the Congress is not going to go vote to spend $40 billion on the border to secure the border. I, as your king, could do it for $40, but no one would ever elect me because they don't want that border problem solved. You have to understand that when it comes to border issues, the government is not your friend. But when it comes to blowing up Russians and Reds and commies overseas and Chinese as well, the U.S. government's your guy. They're really good at that. They've got that military industrial complex that's thirsty for money. So I don't know. That's just my 2 cents, and you guys can flame away.
Hey, thanks for having me on this evening. This stream has really blown up, and I try to be a regular watcher, so I appreciate all the discussion, and glad I can bring the blue water perspective for what it's worth. As far as Ukraine goes, I think they're going to win eventually. The Russian army is going to die in Ukraine because they have the public support. Taiwan, I think, might be a similar path if they can win that global support, and that's a big if. That being said, you got to understand about the global order, okay? The Chinese Navy, their whole government was able to amass all that wealth and power because the U.S. Navy and your taxpayer money supported a world order that promoted free trade and globalization. And without those two things, China would never have been able to pull itself out of its ass-backward socialism. I'm just going to be honest, all right? You know, the baristas who talk about socialism being the best thing ever. You know what? They don't read history. And I'm sure Chad would agree. A lot of you guys would agree. China was able to get rich because of America. We control the dollar. Okay, it's still the global reserve currency. The yuan's not even close. You'll read some edgy articles talking about crypto and talking about how the yuan might be more important. It's not even close. Even with the money printing we do, and believe me, we do money printing, and it's disturbing to me, we still have so much of an advantage over China economically, holding the global reserve currency, and that's a whole different conversation. I can go talk blue in my face, and much smarter people can talk till they're blue in their faces about ships versus ships, planes versus planes. That stuff's fun, all right? That stuff's interesting to talk about. It's also terrifying to think about because so many people would die if it were to come to fruition, as we're seeing right now in Ukraine. But a lot of that stuff is pedantic if the Taiwanese don't have the public support. And that I can't predict for you. It just depends on how good their social media is, how much sympathy they can garner from the rest of Asia, and how many people want to bend the knee to the Chinese and get, excuse my French, butt fucked by authoritarians, or how many people want to go down the freedom path and, maybe have a little bit of liberal democracy, maybe have to do things a little more, difficult in Southeast Asia, but at least you have your self-respect and at least you have some freedom of speech. So we're seeing that. The greater war is happening here in America as well. All right, so I encourage you all to vote in the midterms as well if you value your freedom and your freedom of speech and your ability to have a say in what the government tells you. Because you know what? The powers that be that want to censor people and have more of an authoritarian outlook here in this country, they're very powerful and they're very well funded. And we have to go peacefully to the ballot box and tell them how we feel. So I do believe in that process. But again, thanks for having me on board. And I'm sorry, the Navy's expensive. It's always been expensive. Jefferson wanted to have a bunch of little sailboats defend the coast and us to dig trenches on the beach. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. You have to have your military industrial complex and you have to have the big expensive Navy. Each destroyer is a little less than $2 billion. I'm sorry. We can try and cut the fat. We can try to cut the fat. We can try and cut some fraud, waste, and abuse and buy better with our dollar. But unless you want to just see what happens around the world and give up the Navy, I don't know what the alternative is. We can't threaten people with nukes. Look what happened. Look what's happening with Putin. He's got all the nukes in the world. It's not making people stop arming Ukraine. Thank you very much.
You want me to talk again, or?
Chad, tell us about that. Tell us about that fire extinguisher. I got some guys coming out tomorrow to check that. I'm not sure when that's been inspected, or maybe if it's just a prop for your stream background. I don't think the guys understand that you're green screen, and that's just an image projected behind you and not really where you live. But you go ahead and explain your situation because they're really concerned about that fire extinguisher.
Yeah, it's a kitty. I bought it last year, so I don't. That's all I know.
All right, sorry, Chad. I forgot you already went, man. All right, guys. Everybody's had some really outstanding points. I can't say anything new other than what's already been said. So my personal take is I think the Chinese have looked at this Ukrainian invasion by the Russians and have taken, obviously, extensive notes because it's not going very well for them. And essentially, the NATO nations have rallied, and they're arming the hell out of Ukraine. And the Russians have had some major setbacks. So I don't particularly think that the Chinese were going to invade sooner than later. However, I do believe that they will eventually do it. When that happens, I don't know. I know we were talking when the Russian invasion first kicked off that it would be the ideal time for the Chinese to move, given that it came on the heels of Afghanistan falling and everything else. But the Chinese blew that window of opportunity. And as it stands right now, I think they're in a worse place if they were looking at launching that invasion. So they are seeing that the economic sanctions levied against the Russians, they are seeing the Russian setbacks. And I do think that's probably going to have an impact on any type of Chinese military offensive planning when it comes to taking the country of Taiwan. So, with that said, guys, do we have any saved rounds before we close out?
Of course. Where would it be if I didn't say fuck Trudeau?
Great.
I'm ready to pick them chilies, boys. Y'all talking about me going to California, getting in an honest day's pay. You let me know when. All right, I'm out there.
Y'all are killing me, man. All right, guys. Well, that's it. Doc, do you have any hats to put on or anything like that?
I'll bring it next time.
All right, guys. Have a good night.
Later.